I am going to talk to you today about thinking and boundaries. Now, I probably say this a lot of the time. Everything I talk about is my favorite thing to talk about, but this is especially one of my favorite things to talk about because I find the majority of the people that I work with have some form of depression or some sort of form of anxiety that they're dealing with. And I find the vast amount of the people that I'm working with, this is actually the reason why they're dealing with difficulty with depression and anxiety. And if you know anything about depression and anxiety, those aren't just two diagnoses. It's not just depression and anxiety. Those are actually umbrella terms for many different diagnoses. So there are anxiety disorders and there are depression disorders or mood disorders. And a lot of those I find, this is the root. We don't have good boundaries. And where do we learn boundaries? In our homes growing up, in our schools. I will tell you, I had a fun time learning boundaries. I'm being slightly sarcastic. I had a fun time learning boundaries because, one, I was a very literal child growing up. If you were talking to me on the phone and you said, "I'll call you later," I thought you were literally going to call me later that day. And so as a little girl, or seemingly little girl, I would not literally wait by the phone for you to call, but I would be anticipating your phone call later. Because that's just how I was. I was pretty naive. And it wasn't until I grew up that I realized, sometimes people say things that they don't mean. Some people say they're going to do something and then they don't. And you get disappointed. And what do you do then? Well, sometimes a boundary is something that we need to set. And then years later, when I became a therapist, it wasn't my first job as a therapist, but further down as I was a therapist, I started working in a group home with at-risk teens. And I realized a lot of the kids that I was working with, they had learned how to be manipulators very young. And I believed them. They were very convincing. Until I learned that I couldn't believe them. And then I learned different ways to recognize whether or not they were telling the truth. And I'm very grateful and thankful to God, and this is something that I want you to think about, that sometimes God lets us go through difficult things so he can teach us about people. Because doesn't the Bible tell us that we're to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves? Well, sometimes we're not very gentle because we're afraid. We don't trust ourselves when people hurt us. And sometimes we're not very wise because we say, well, we let people do all sorts of things and we don't give them any consequences for their behaviors. And so I do believe that we actually honor and glorify God when he can teach us how to be wise and gentle. And so I want to help teach you that today too, how to be wise and gentle. So let's look at what does boundaries mean. I used to hate this. When I was younger, I used to, sometimes a pastor will get up and they'll, have a title of their sermon and they'll give that title and then they'll say something like, well, Webster's dictionary says that this is what this means. And I used to go, oh, we all know what that means, don't we? And then I realized, no, we don't. Do you know, sometimes arguments get started because two people are using the same word, but they define that word differently. And sometimes people are using two different words, but they're defining them the same way, and they're arguing, not realizing they actually agree. But it's not until somebody goes, wait, I think what you're saying is the same thing as what you're saying. Why are you disagreeing? Well, we're using different words. Doesn't that make us different? We're not on the same. No, you actually agree with each other. You're just using different terminology. And so I do think it's important. And so when we talk about boundaries, it's important to understand, what does boundaries mean? I like to sum it up in one word: expectations. Now, when you have a fence between you and your neighbor, what does that fence tell you? This is my property. It stops right here. And your property continues beyond that point, right? Aren't those expectations? Do you want your neighbor hopping over the fence, drilling through the fence, cutting holes through it, and coming into your property and doing whatever they want? Not necessarily. Some of us are nicer than others. We don't care if a frisbee goes over, a ball goes over. We're happy to help. But it tells you what to expect. It tells you, I expect that I'm going to take care of my property, and I expect you're going to take care of your property, and this fence gives us a guideline. Otherwise, we don't necessarily know what that is. But do you know boundaries show up in other areas of our lives too? How about with children? What would children be like without boundaries? I think movies have been made about this. I've heard about them. I don't know what they're actually about, but I've heard that, there was a movie that was made about kids who didn't have parents. I can tell you a story, actually. They did a scientific experiment. Well, I didn't mean to be an experiment, but in Africa, they had all of these extra elephants. I don't know how you decide you have extra of elephants, but they had too many elephants in Africa. And so what they decided to do is they were going to weed out the elephants because there were too many of them. And so they got rid of the adult elephants. Well, what do you think happened? All of a sudden, they started noticing that the rhinos were dying. And they did a little bit more research, and they realized it was actually the elephants that were killing the rhinos. Now, in Africa, I don't know if you know this, but rhinos are not afraid of elephants. Elephants are not predators of rhinos. But for some reason, these rhinos were being killed by elephants. Well, who was doing the killing? Adolescent elephants. They didn't have any adult elephants telling them, hey, you're not supposed to do this. This is not what we do. You don't need to do this. And they weren't just killing them for food. They were just harassing them, just taking advantage of them and doing whatever they wanted to. Do you know what happened? These scientists, these people who study these animals, I don't know about you, but I think I could have done this better. They decided, okay, we're going to have to get some adult elephants back. Maybe that'll help. They brought 2 adult elephants back into the whole of this reserve in Africa. Do you know what happened? All the adolescent elephants stopped killing the rhinos. They only needed 2, and they were even female elephants. They only needed 2. Checked all the other adolescent elephants, and they stopped doing harm to the rhinos. How about kids? Those are elephants. What about human children? Do you think human children need boundaries and expectations?
Definitely.
I have a niece. She's 9 years old, but when she was 4, I saw her. Literally, she found a candy bar. She loves chocolate. Like if there's anything she'll eat a lot of, it's chocolate. I found her in a corner once hiding with a chocolate bar because my sister wasn't watching. And she found that chocolate bar and was just, so enamored by that chocolate bar. But she would eat chocolate all day, every day. What would happen if she did? Good things would not happen if she did that. And kids, we know this, that's why God gave children parents, right? So children need expectations. How about school assignments and tests? I used to teach psychology at Weimar University, and every single time, even despite giving all of my students a curriculum, as soon as I told them that I was going to give them a test, you know what they did? What's going to be on the test? How are you going to grade the test? We all have expectations. How do we know what to do? How do we know how to study if somebody doesn't tell us what to study for? We need expectations. We need boundaries. How about traffic laws? How comfortable would you be if you got out on the road and you knew other people weren't obeying the traffic laws? What are those traffic laws for? For your safety, their protection. But those are boundaries, they're expectations. I was driving with my husband along Highway 1 in California, along the coast. Anybody ever do that in Northern California? Does anybody know there's a section? It is the scariest drive I have ever been on. Literally, this is where the passenger sits in the car, and right about where that step is right there is where there's a complete drop-off into the ocean. And when I say drop off, like Grand Canyon size drop off. And it goes straight down, and my husband is driving. He's not an unsafe driver, but I have never felt so scared in my entire life as I was sitting, looking over the edge, going, dear Lord, please don't let anything happen. Why is there not a guardrail here? Because I feel more protected when there's a boundary between me and harm, right? How about dating? Do you ever have expectations for dating? I see some people here that look like they're married. I don't know if you're dating or married. I'm assuming most of you are probably married. But did you not have expectations? Was your significant other allowed to date whoever they wanted while they were with you? How about marriage? When you got married, did you know every single one of you had boundaries in your marriage? What do we call them? They start with a V. Vows. Aren't those boundaries? I promise that you are going to be the only one. I'm saying what I expect, and you're saying what you expect back. Those are boundaries. We should appreciate those. I do. How about jobs? Do you like going into a job being told to do whatever they decide they want you to do at any given moment and not know, well, is this really my job or is this somebody else's job they're just wanting me to do? I appreciate when I get a job description, don't you? Yes. Otherwise, they can make you do whatever they want to. And how do I know I'm not doing two people's job for one person's salary? I like knowing expectations and having boundaries. And sometimes I've even had to use them. I had a boss once who told me, I used to work 7 days on call. That meant 24/7 I was on call when I was in the group home. And my boss came in to one of our meetings. We took turns. There were 7 of us that took turns. So every 7 weeks I was on call for a week. And because of that week being on call, I got a day off to compensate for that. Well, my boss came into our meeting one day and found out that whoever had been on call that week that was reporting on all the things that had happened hadn't had to respond to any calls. So you know what he said? Well, why don't we just eliminate this day off thing, since some of you don't get calls during your time off or your on-call time? And I said, oh no. I didn't say it exactly like that. Just a second. I said, oh no. And I said, you know, I have actually missed a baptism in the past because I was on call and had to respond to somebody, a crisis situation at the group home. I regularly for a week took my phone into the bathroom with me every single time I went to the bathroom and to take a shower. I took that phone with me wherever I was. I had to make accommodations so that if I couldn't get out, I couldn't go to something, even because of it. Do you think I was worth that day off at the end of that week, even if nobody called me? Absolutely. And I told him that. Now, I don't think he liked it, but do you know what happened? We continued to get our day off at the end of the week because I set a boundary. These things are very important, and I did already talk about marriage. But you know, just like yesterday we talked about intrapersonal and interpersonal, well, each one of us, sometimes when we think about boundaries, we think only about boundaries between me and you and me. We don't think about boundaries within ourselves. What do we call boundaries within ourselves? Self-control. When I have self-control, that's a boundary that I have with myself. And so we have different types of intrapersonal boundaries. One type of interpersonal boundary is physical and sexual. Another one is mental and emotional. We also have social, and we also have spiritual. Every single one of us should take an assessment of what our boundaries are with ourselves in these different categories. Some of us have trouble in our lives because we haven't developed boundaries in these areas. But just like intrapersonal, we should also have these same boundaries with other people too. So when it comes to physical and sexual, we've already talked about dating. We should have physical and sexual boundaries in dating, but we should also have those in our friendships. One of the things I teach sexual harassment training, or I do sexual harassment trainings. I've just started to do this. And one of the things I encourage people to recognize is your relationships with the opposite sex. Now, I know we live in a world now where it almost doesn't matter if it's the opposite sex or the same sex in some situations. But I was actually really proud. Now, this is not a political statement, but when I heard Mike Pence, did anybody hear Mike Pence had a physical boundary? He actually shared this with people. And again, this is not indicative of my political leanings, but I was just very impressed when I heard that he told everybody in his office knew that he would never meet with a woman alone for a meeting. And some people got upset with that. What, do you think you're going to do something wrong? And I thought to myself, that's not just for him. That boundary's for the woman too. She knows, I don't ever have to worry about being in a room with just him and something happening. But vice versa, he never had to worry about a woman making a claim that something had happened because he was never in a room alone with a woman. And how could that be if he made that boundary? And so having physical and sexual boundaries, especially in this day and age when we have Me Too movements and things like that, we should have very strong boundaries. And I'm saying this to the pastors too, especially the pastors, because you can want to do God's work and do it with all your might and have a very contrite heart and a gentle spirit, but we live in a world where these things happen. And so we have to be careful. We have to have boundaries with people, no matter what your role is. And jobs are even making sure that people do this, but I think we can go a step further as Christians too. How about mental and emotional boundaries? What kinds of things do you consume in your head? I've always had a fascination with psychology, and I can tell you sometimes I'm interested in reading about things that are probably not the healthiest things for me to read about because I'm curious and I love how the mind works and stuff, but I've had to stop even looking up certain things that I know would affect me, would cause me to fear the world even more, to be more timid about who I'm around. I'm not saying that that I'm doing dangerous things, but I don't want to be afraid every time I leave my house because of what I'm watching on television that's feeding my fear, right? And sometimes it's the news, sometimes it's television shows and stuff that we consume, and we don't realize how they're breaking us down emotionally and mentally because we're consuming these things. How about socially? You know, sometimes I can't be around people all the time because I just need to get my sleep. I spend 9 hours with people hearing their problems all day, every day, and I love doing it. But I have to take time away from people in order to recoup and rejuvenate so that I can be around people the next day. And sometimes I have to say no to people, and I hate saying no, but I know it's the only thing I can do to make sure I'm able to do it the next time I'm responsible. And spiritually too, we should have spiritual boundaries. Our number one spiritual boundary should be our time with God. Do we set apart time in our day to spend time with God? And I'm going to get into this more, but remember I said yesterday, and we've been talking about this all week, our boundaries, I find it's not just can I implement a boundary or do I know how to implement a boundary? The bigger thing is, do I even know why I'm implementing this boundary? Do I really believe in this boundary? And so for all of us, we have to know what we really believe about boundaries in order to be able to implement a boundary in a healthy way. So I'm going to go through some common statements that I hear people say that keeps them from having boundaries with people in healthy ways when they need to be had. The first one, I hope you can see this, boundaries are mean. Are you ever tempted to think boundaries are mean? I hear no, but I know better. I talk to people all the time, and sometimes people say, well, I don't want to do that because what if they think I'm being mean? And so I like to ask the questions, are boundaries really mean? Are they really mean? Is putting a fence up between two homes a mean thing to do? Is giving your employee a list of job expectations And then asking them, hey, I notice you haven't been doing these. Is that mean? What happens if you don't confront them if they're not doing those expectations? Somebody else might be having to do more work. Isn't that mean? Isn't that unkind? Isn't it unkind to a company that's paying you for a certain amount of work not to do the work that they expect you to do? I like to tell people, and I want you, if there's nothing else that you learn from this afternoon, it's that healthy boundaries are healthy for both parties. There's no such thing as a healthy boundary that's only good for one person in the party. Healthy boundaries are always for both people, or both parties represented. So the second thing we want to ask is, how do boundaries actually help others? How might this boundary actually help another person? I could have my kids say, oh, Mom, you only want me to clean my room because you're just so super picky about your rooms being all nice and clean and everything like that. You don't really care about me. You just care about how clean the room is. As a mom, is that the only thing I care about? No. I want my kid to grow up and have the greatest potential for the best roommate in the future, or the best spouse in the future. And if they don't clean their room, what's going to happen? If they don't learn to keep their space tidy, what's going to happen? Well, slops might be okay with living with them, but is that the best that they could do? No. So boundaries aren't mean. Boundaries are for my kid no matter what they say. Am I confusing how I or the other person feels with what is actually mean or unkind? The second thing I want you to remember is facts don't care about your feelings. I'm going to touch on this later too. But just because I feel a certain way doesn't mean my feelings are an indication of how things are. We call that emotional reasoning. And a lot of us do this. We get stuck in our feelings. And we forget to look for the facts. We forget to look for the evidence. I think Katie probably talked to you about this. I wasn't here for the first 3 days that she was here. But when I want to look to see if something is true, I have to look to see if there's evidence to support it. And I've had people tell me before that I was being mean, or I've even had people suggest it just by saying, wow, I can't believe you said that to that person. And I would say back, said what? Well, you said that you didn't want to do that, or that you wouldn't do that. And I would say, what's wrong with that? Well, I don't know, but I couldn't say that. Do you know what? Sometimes saying it myself gives someone else permission to say the same thing later when they need to say it too. So it's actually one of the kindest gestures you can do is to stand up for something and do it when it's the right thing to do, even if you feel bad for doing it. You know what? You will feel bad sometimes. That's okay. But you'll have a clear conscience. What's better, feeling a little bit guilty or having a clear conscience? I always say a clear conscience is the softest pillow you can sleep on. And sometimes I go to bed and I think, oh man, should I have said that? And then I do a little thinking in my head and I go, okay, what I said was right. I know based on this, this, and that. And so even though I don't feel good about it, I know I did the right thing. And I'm going to wait for my feelings to catch up. Don't you think that's helpful? Yes. Absolutely. How about if the other person doesn't like my boundary, I should change it? No, you guys are getting smarter just by being here all week. I can see. No, don't do that. Don't believe that. But sometimes this is true. How about when maybe your kid says, I hate you. You're the worst mom. You're the worst dad ever. Or somebody even says you're being selfish. I'm tempted to believe that sometimes. Well, maybe I am. I'm supposed to be a good Christian, and I'm supposed to be kind and selfless, and they're calling me selfish. Maybe I should do something different. But let's ask a question. Do they just not like it, even though it might actually be a good boundary? How many times do people not like boundaries initially, but later they'll come back and thank you? Do you know how I can count at least 5 clients on my hand who have come back to me afterwards and thanked me for having a boundary with them? But you wouldn't know it right after I implemented the boundary. You know why? I had one person in particular, he was going through a divorce, and I had tried to help him, maintain the relationship with his wife initially, but she decided that she didn't want to have anything to do with him after all. And, I don't think people are perfect, but I didn't think it was that big of an issue that they should actually get divorced over this thing. And he wanted to do the right thing, and he wanted to stick it out even if he was suffering, but she didn't want to stay married to him. And what was he to do? He prayed about it. He spent years waiting for her to come around, and she finally signed the papers and didn't want to have any, she moved out and everything. And do you know what his friends told him? You just need to get into another relationship so you can forget about her. What do you think I said to him? I said, please don't do that. I said, please don't do that. Your friends want to be nice to you. They want you to think that they're being supportive, but that's not what you need right now. You've gone through a lot in the last several years, and this is not the time to get into a relationship. You need to unpack some of that baggage that you've been, building up over time, and you need to process it before you do anything in a relationship. And he got really upset. He didn't like that. He got really, really upset. Ugh. Fortunately, it was about the end of the therapy session, so he got up, he stomped out, and I said, please, just hear what I have to say. Don't make any decisions right now. Just think about it. And he stomped out of my office, and I thought, oh man, I've just lost a client. He's not coming back. Well, I ended my day, and I was still thinking about it, and I was reeling. By the way, just because you have good thinking doesn't mean you're not tempted, okay? I want people to know this. And I was reeling on it a bit. I was thinking, oh man, I really like this person. I want to continue working with him. He's really willing to do good things. He's just in a bad place right now. And so what happened is I went home. I kept thinking about it. But I put it in God's hands too. I was praying about it. And the next day I went into work and I checked my email, and what do you know? I had an email from him. Does anybody want to know when the email was sent? Right after the session. I hadn't looked at my email. Do you know what he said? Amanda, I'm so sorry I threw a tantrum in your office. Thank you. I know you really care about me and you want the best for me, and I'm going to wait. If I had just trusted what he did in the moment, I could have easily said, oh no, never mind. Go find a relationship if it makes you happy. I probably said too much. I shouldn't have said it. But in reality, he knew that that's what he needed to do. He was just struggling with making that final decision to do it. And sometimes people need to hear things that they don't like to hear, right? And having a boundary and even helping other people have a boundary is important. How about if I make this boundary, it's permanent? Sometimes boundaries are just for a time. For right now. Maybe somebody has hurt me, and I need to learn to trust them again. And so I have to create a boundary that in the meantime, until I can trust you, this is how it's going to be. And I need you to do this to show me that I can trust you. But sometimes we think, oh, well, I don't want to do this forever. You don't have to do it forever. Sometimes it's just for the current time. So the question is, do I really have to stick to this forever? Or is it possible that this is only necessary for a time, and maybe I can change it if things change? Just like children grow and mature, and you don't have to have the same boundaries with them at the same or later just because you had them for a certain time. We have boundaries. Kids aren't, I don't know about here, but in California, you can't drive until you're 16. That's a boundary. But then what happens to that boundary when you turn 16? You can start driving, right? And so it's just for a certain period of time. Now, they've added some new laws where you can't take other kids in the car with you until you're a certain age and stuff. But those even change over time based on maturity. How about if I feel guilty for making a boundary, I must be a bad person? Are you a bad person just because you feel guilty? I want to talk about this one for a little bit because I've noticed this one is a big one. There is something we call projection in therapy. Has anybody heard of that term, projection in therapy? What does a projector do? We have a projector here, by the way. What is the projector doing here? It's taking a small picture that's either on the computer, sometimes it can even be your phone, and it blows it up and it puts it up on the wall, right? This is very similar to projection in psychology. Projection means I have certain qualities about myself that I don't like, but maybe I'm uncomfortable admitting it. Maybe I'm selfish. So instead of admitting that I'm selfish, I'm going to make you feel selfish. I'm going to make you feel selfish. I'm going to put that selfishness on you. So I find a time when you're doing something that maybe, say for instance, everybody in here gets a nice cold, I shouldn't say this when we're all hot, but say I give you all a nice cold glass of water, juice, something that you really like. And I guzzle mine down and I say, I want yours. And you say, well, I really want to finish this. This is mine. And I say, well, you know what? You're being selfish. You guys answer better than some of my clients do. You guys must be like that far ahead of them. I love this. No, I'm hearing some adamant no's. Go for it. Yeah. But what if I say, you know what? You're supposed to be a Christian and you're supposed to share. And how come you're not sharing with me? Doesn't that feel ugly and gross? Yeah, you had yours. That's what I heard. I did have mine. Now, I would never do that. But sometimes people do this to us. They project their own unkind characteristics on us, hoping that they won't have to deal with them. And here's the thing. We have another term. It's called projective identification. As soon as you identify with being selfish for not giving me what I want, that means you are now identifying with the projection. And I've got you right where I want you. Because you'll give me anything right now, rather than be called selfish. But really, who's the selfish person here? It's okay, I am. I'm being selfish because I'm asking for something that's not mine. Now, here's the deal. As soon as you identify with the projection, you are taking the responsibility off of me to deal with that un-Christ-like characteristic. And you are taking it on yourself so I don't have to deal with it. But do you know how many of us have learned to do this? Maybe our parents told us we were selfish if they didn't get whatever they wanted. Maybe a teacher or somebody in a position of authority told us this. I see this happen sometimes with sexual abuse situations. We call it grooming. That person will say whatever they can to get you to agree that they are still a person of authority and deserve to be treated as such, even though they're taking advantage of another person, and that might be you. And I see people take the responsibility, oh, I must have done something wrong that they did this to me. Is that true? No, not at all. And even if you feel guilty, that's not accurate guilt. There's appropriate guilt and there's inappropriate guilt. Appropriate guilt is when you've done something wrong. And we should feel bad. We should have a healthy relationship. I have a talk that I do on guilt. If you want to listen to that, it's on audioverse.org. You can just type in my name and find it. I'll go more into that in there. But there's appropriate guilt, and appropriate guilt is when you've done something wrong. Inappropriate guilt is when you feel like you've done something wrong even though you haven't done something wrong because somebody else is projecting their guilt onto you. And then there's another inappropriate guilt too. And that's when Satan convinces you that you cannot be made whole after you are guilty and that you have to hold on to that guilt forever, that guilt and that shame forever. But he who began a good work in you is faithful to complete it. And just because you've done something wrong, please don't let Satan convince you that you can't be made whole or that you aren't whole after you've confessed your sin and made it right. You can walk freely from that place and go forward. But that doesn't mean you get to go do it again. Otherwise, that's appropriate guilt. But inappropriate guilt is in two forms. When we believe that we're guilty for something we haven't done, and when we believe we can't be made right when God promises to make us whole. So I've answered some of these, but have I seen others make boundaries that are hard but good? Are my feelings accurate to what is happening? And maybe I feel guilty because I'm just not used to setting boundaries yet. Do you know sometimes that's a reason we don't feel good about boundaries? How good do you feel about doing something you've never done before? You know, as adults, sometimes we're really hard on ourselves. I like to tell adults, you know, when you first learned how to walk, or actually, let me take that back. Think of a child in your life that has recently learned how to walk. When that child takes their first step and then falls, what does every single person in the room do? That's not what they do. I'm hearing the wrong answer. Yeah, you just took a step. Oh my goodness. Oh, did you see? He just took a step. Isn't it wonderful he's walking? He's not walking. He took a step and fell. But what do we do when we're adults and we try something new and we fall? Oh, I can't believe I just fell. I'm never doing this again. What's the difference? The age that you did it. Don't expect perfection when you're trying something new. Just keep doing it until you get better at it. Just like a baby learns how to walk. One step, fall, up again, another step, fall, up again, maybe a couple more steps, fall, up again. We're going to fall too when we have boundaries, but it's okay. We're doing it for the first time maybe. It's okay to fall every once in a while. Just get back up and try again. And you'll actually get good. I wasn't good at boundaries initially. I was bad. I liked what Pastor Hernandez said yesterday. Be willing to apologize. If you do something wrong, I tried to have boundaries with kids in the group home, and sometimes I said things with the wrong attitude, and I'd have to go up afterwards and say, I'm so sorry. I still think you need to do this, but the way I said it wasn't appropriate. But I need you to do it. And I'm here to apologize for the way I said it, but you still need to do it. Do you know how nice they would be afterwards? Like, wow, why are you apologizing to me? Nobody else does this. And then they would do it because they'd never seen that before. It was new to them. It's okay to apologize and do it again. I'm losing my microphone here. Boundaries bring bad consequences. I was just having a conversation with somebody yesterday who said something very similar to this, like this to me. And what I said to this person is I said, it wasn't your boundary that brought the bad consequences. It was the person's behavior that made you implement the boundary that caused the consequences. What do you think about that? Sometimes we inappropriately take responsibility. Oh, that breeze feels so good again. Thank you, Lord. Sometimes we take responsibility for the consequences when we didn't start the chain of events. And sometimes we'll inappropriately say, oh, I'm the reason. I told this person they couldn't do it. Now they're all angry at me and angry at everybody else. And now it's causing this big to-do. Well, that's not your fault. The person who did the bad behavior, that's their fault that these consequences are happening. That all of this is happening. And sometimes it's the boundary that actually corrects it. So, our boundaries can still be good even when the consequences are bad. I challenge you, look for times in the Bible. I do this with all of my clients. When they're having difficulty with something, I say, I want you to do a sermon on this. Now, you may never preach this sermon, but I want you to write your own sermon on this difficult issue that you're dealing with. And if you have trouble with boundaries, one of the things that you can do is just go through the Bible and do a study on boundaries. See what God has to say about it. Look at stories in the Bible that have to do with boundaries. Implement those into your talk. Do you know why I ask my clients to do this, even though they're never going to give the sermon? It's for them. They need to reinforce it in their own minds. And that's one of the beautiful things I've learned about studying the Bible is it's not for anybody else necessarily. Now, I do give talks, so yeah, it does help other people sometimes, but it's more so for me. If I learn these things and I implement these things, then I can share about them so much better because it's a part of me that I'm sharing them. What if I never let their reaction teach me to respond differently? And I stick with this boundary. This is good. I like to add some scientific backup in my talks, and I found this from Stephen Bavelek, author of the University of Michigan Nurturing Parenting Community Education Program. Say that fast in one breath. The purpose of family rules is for parents and children to establish consistent guidelines that will help everyone know what is and what isn't expected of them. Setting boundaries and expectations for children, and I would suggest adults too, can assist in building life skills that include patience, problem solving, resourcefulness, responsibility, and self-discipline. Now, how many people in this world have all those character traits? So just like kids that need to learn some of these things, sometimes we need to have boundaries because we might be the first person that this other adult is interacting with that is setting a boundary to help them learn these things. And when I set boundaries, it helps them also have better relationships with other people if they're willing to abide by those boundaries. But you know what? God has boundaries too. If all of these weren't enough, God actually has boundaries too. And I love this in Exodus 20. It says, and God spoke all these things saying, thou shalt. What are all those 10 commandments actually? They're boundaries. Now, yes, we can make an example and say, well, some of these are for God because he just wanted them that way. But who benefited and who benefits from at least the last half of the boundaries? We do. Our society does. I heard somewhere that our Constitution was actually somewhere, I think it was between like 40 and 60% biblical. There are exact phrases taken out of the Bible and put in the Constitution. The Constitution is a boundary, right? God gave us his own Constitution. It's a boundary for us. We actually interact better when we don't hurt each other, when we don't lie, when we don't take things that aren't ours. But we actually work better too when we rest. That's a personal boundary that we take, and also an interpersonal boundary that we have with God. But the first commandments are God's boundaries with us. This is how I want you to treat me. And it's never not for our good, right? But then we also find in Leviticus 18, and I think this is an important one for us to read, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, for whosoever shall commit any of these abominations, even the souls that commit them shall be cut off from among the people. Now, this sounds like a really drastic discipline. They're going to be cut off from the people? That sounds really mean, God. Why are you doing that? Why is God doing this, though? To protect and preserve those who are following his law. I fully, well, maybe not fully, but I understood this more so when I worked in the group home, because in each house that I worked in, there were 6 kids. 6 kids in each house, and mostly they were boys. We actually had some girls, but then girls weren't as bad as the boys, so we sometimes had empty spots in our home, so we just turned that last house into a boys' home. And so we had 6 boys in a house, and occasionally they would actually be doing pretty well. All 6 boys would be doing well. And then one of the boys, it was their turn to graduate from the program. They stayed there 9 to 12 months. And that boy would leave, and another boy would come in. And I would hear things like the staff would say, oh, this new boy is so nice. I like him so much. But I started noticing the other 5 boys' behavior would change. They weren't so good anymore. They were starting to do things that they hadn't done when the other kid was there, before the other kid left. But I would still hear, I'd get this suspicion, like, what's going on here? But the staff would say, oh, he complimented me today, and oh, he's so nice. And I would say, yeah, but there's something up. Why has the dynamic changed so much? And we'd find out it was that one new kid that was schmoozing and manipulating all the adult staff, but was causing the kids to get in trouble. And I would say, we need to get rid of this kid. And it was like God saying, see, Amanda, now you know why I kicked Lucifer out of heaven. See, Amanda, now you know why sometimes I punish people. Because what happens to everyone else when we don't punish the person? It infects the whole lot. What happens if you have a rotten apple in your fruit basket at home and you don't take it out? It hurts the others. And sometimes this is a boundary we hate to do. I know I'm almost contradicting what I said yesterday, but sometimes we have people in the church who are hurting the church. And maybe we like them, but something they're doing is not doing good for the church. We might have to confront that person and talk to them, and we want to do it in the Matthew way. But if the behavior doesn't change and more people are getting hurt, we have to be willing to say enough is enough. And we're not going to let anyone else be hurt by this. God does this. It's okay when we need to do it too. Jesus set boundaries though too. Now this is not a quote from the Bible, but this is something I've often imagined telling my clients. Father, you know I'm going to earth. Well, we've been together for a really long time, and we'll be together for a really long time when I get back. So I'm thinking during my time on earth, I'm just going to make the most of my time and get as much stuff done as I can, so you'll understand if I don't talk to you as much and just focus on what I'm down there for. Who needs to hear this? The busy person. Because sometimes we say to ourselves, we have very poor intrapersonal boundaries because we say to ourselves, well, I'm doing good work. I'm just going to keep going and going and going and going, even if it hurts me. But did Jesus ever say this? You know how many pastors I've heard give their testimonies where they just went and went and went and they told themselves, you know what, I'm a pastor. God will take care of me even if I'm not taking care of myself. And do you know what many of those pastors had to experience? Serious health issues, mental health issues, physical health issues, only for God to teach them, you know what? Even Jesus took care of himself on the earth. He was human. He needed to take care of himself. He often went away. And I'm going to go through some of these characteristics. So Jesus had intrapersonal boundaries. What are intrapersonal boundaries? Within himself. He withdrew from the crowds to go away to retreat. He could have healed one more person. Just one more. He could have talked to one more person. But he went to retreat. He was always appropriate with women such as Mary Magdalene. When I heard of that movie, The Da Vinci Code, I got really upset. I've never watched it, but I heard about it. Anything I learn about the world is from my clients. You'd be surprised how many things I learned that I don't have to go looking for. They just share these things with me. I saw this movie. It was so great. I think Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a relationship and they were romantically involved. I'm like, what?
Oh my goodness.
What kind of example would that have set for us if that was the actual story? But no, Jesus was so appropriate with her. Why else would she come back and treat him the way that she did when she knew he was going to suffer on the cross? She didn't go back because she was afraid to. She went back because he was the nicest man that ever treated her. The kindest, most loving man that ever treated her. And we should have men like that today too, women as well. But the other thing that, and here's an acronym: connection, hydration, optimism, oxygen, self-control, exercise, light, internal clock, food, and environment. I'm not going to go through all of these, but what does this spell? Choose life. This is an acronym we use at our office. And I'm just going to focus on the first one because connection, as much as we need to separate, Christ also connected. He connected with his Father on a daily basis, and he connected with others on a daily basis. And he was even shown to have a connection with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, like a different kind of connection than just anyone else. He chose to hang out with them. He also had emotional and mental interpersonal boundaries. He lived an unhurried pace of life. He was deliberate and never impulsive. Even when people thought, "What are you doing, Jesus? You should go over here and do this, and you should go over here and do this and do that and everything." But he was unhurried. You know, sometimes we act on impulse because we feel like we have to. There's an anxiety in us to get something done. You know, if you have this problem, I'm going to give you a phrase that I'd like you to implement in your life. When somebody asks you to do something, I want you just to say this: "Oh, that's interesting. Let me think about it." You know, you don't have to say yes or no right away. You can say, "That's interesting. Let me think about it." And if you're married, oh, this is my favorite one. "Oh, that's interesting. Let me talk to my husband about that." It makes you look like you're really considerate of your spouse and you're just buying time. Now, I hope you'll talk to your spouse about it too, but you're buying time because sometimes in the moment we feel like we should do something, but we realize we're after weighing the pros and the cons, just like we heard yesterday in Pastor Hernandez's talk, sometimes I may be choosing my parishioners or my church, but what's happening at home with my family? And I don't want to necessarily do more when my family needs me. There's something going on in my family, maybe my children or something like that. And it's okay to choose. You're always, do you know that term FOMO? You heard that? Fear of missing out. Do you know you're always missing out? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, FOMO, fear of missing out. Do you know being in here, you know what you're missing out on? Anything that's outside of this building. But if you're outside of this building, you're missing out on what's happening in here. When you're married, you're missing out on being single. When you're single, you're missing out on being married. When you have children, you're missing out on sleep. And when you don't have children, you're missing out on hearing, "Mommy, I love you." You're always missing out. You just get to figure out which one you want to miss out on. It's so much easier that way. Don't live a rushed, fast pace of life just because you're afraid. Be afraid of doing too much. I like JOMO better, the joy of missing out. There are just some things I don't need to experience. It's okay with me. Even sometimes people will say, "Oh, you know, you should go on vacation more." Do you know all my vacations are surrounded by speaking engagements practically? I get to go on some cool trips, by the way. But I never have to plan my vacation because I just go wherever I'm going already for speaking, and then I add a day or something onto that and get to sightsee. And people say, "Oh, don't you wish you went on a vacation?" Don't feel bad for me, by the way. This isn't a martyr story. And I say, when I get to heaven, am I going to look down at this earth and go, "Oh, I wish I went to the Maldives"? No, I'm in heaven. Nothing's going to compare to that. I'm not going to look down here and wish I had done something. It's all going to be burned up anyway. So don't fear missing out on stuff. And Jesus wasn't worried about missing out on stuff. He was worried about not doing what God asked him. He protected himself by focusing only on God's will for his life. Isn't that important? That's the most important thing. And socially, he spent time with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus and his disciples. He had a crew that he spent time with. Some people fear, "Oh, I've got to make over an abundance of friends." Do you know most people don't even have one good friend? Just focus on having a few close people around you or one or two close people around you, even your spouse. That doesn't mean you stay isolated from everybody else. But don't try so anxiously to try to make friends and be everybody's best friend. It's okay. And he had a good balance of other time and alone time. He was well balanced. He spent time alone and he spent time with others. How about spiritually? Well, he spent time with his Father. You can't get any closer to spiritual time than spending time with God. He was mindful of his creation. Nature and life became opportunities for spiritual object lessons. I don't know if you've ever read Christ Object Lessons, but one of my favorite things is hearing stories of like nature and how that relates to God's word and spiritual lessons. I challenge you while you're here the rest of this weekend, find something that you see in nature and find a connection between that and the Bible and a story in the Bible or a principle in the Bible. Take that and make it something, a daily event. That's advanced gratitude, by the way. Is taking something in nature and connecting to a biblical story. He always abandoned the outcome to God. Not my will, but thy will, he said. A lot of times we want to know the end from the beginning. I love Hebrews 11 for that. I don't have to know the end. I just have to know, is right now what I'm doing in line with God's will? And whatever happens will happen. I love the story of Joseph. I have another talk called Diamonds in the Rough if you want to find it on, I believe it's on YouTube. And I love how Joseph just did whatever was the right thing. I actually like stories of people who do the right thing in the Bible too. I know people like stories of people who do the wrong thing and how God gives grace, but it's also nice to hear a story of somebody doing the right thing, every once in a while. And I love the story of Joseph because no matter what situation he's in, he leaves the outcome to God. And then my favorite, well, it's not my favorite, it's one of my favorite verses in the Bible is Genesis 50, verse 20. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. I don't have to determine the outcome when I'm doing something. I just leave it up to God. As long as I know I'm doing the right thing or I've done the right thing, the rest is God's. I don't have to worry about it. He lived according to prophecy because he knew prophecy. A lot of us say, why is this happening to me? And the Bible clearly says these things are going to happen to us. That's a prophetic statement. You are going to have trials and tribulations. But if you read the Bible, it's not surprising when they happen, especially if we haven't done anything wrong. And he lived by it is written. Anytime he was tempted or challenged, he always said, it is written, thus saith the Lord. Physical and sexual, he had interpersonal boundaries. He said no to inappropriate behavior, lust, adultery, etc. We even find that in the commandments, and he often quoted the commandments. He walked away from abuse. Did you know you can walk away when somebody's abusing you because Jesus did so? Now, I'm not talking about the cross. That was prophetic. He knew he had to do that. But before the cross, he did actually walk away from abuse. There were crowds trying to kill him, throw him off a cliff. And he exited quickly. You don't have to stay and endure something that God's not calling you to endure. You can walk away from abuse. That is a boundary that you can set. Sometimes taking the abuse is actually giving the other person permission to sin and continue to sin. And by walking away, I'm keeping them from sinning against me. I don't want them to sin. Mental and emotional, he didn't personalize things. I love Spirit of Prophecy tells us that, and Katie quoted this on Wednesday too, Jesus was never elated by praise nor dejected by censure. He didn't take it personally. You know, if somebody gives you a compliment, do you know what that says? It says something about the person giving you the compliment, that they appreciated it. It doesn't say anything necessarily about you, because next to them will be somebody who didn't like what you did, right? How do you choose? Do you know, I had a boss who told me once I was a horrible communicator. You know why? Because he misunderstood an email I sent to him. How easy is it to misunderstand an email? Do you know how long he misunderstood my email and gave me a hard time about it? 2 months. 2 months, he gave me a hard time and told me I was a poor communicator. He even challenged me to go ask my friends if they thought I was a poor communicator too. And I thought, oh, what do I do? I don't think my friends are going to say that. My friends are far too nice. And do you know the funny thing is, I did ask them and I felt ridiculous doing it. He told me to, so I was like, okay, well, I'll do it just to see. But it was embarrassing to ask them that. Do you know, I had a totally unrelated situation happen that same week. A lady came up to me and said, you know, you're such a good communicator. And I thought, well, now who do I listen to? Because what people say about you is more about them than it is about you. Because even the most ugly comments about ourselves, even if there's some truth to them, maybe I have done something wrong, but did they need to say it that way? No, not necessarily. So it often says more about them than it says about me. I don't have to personalize these things. I take them to God and say, God, is there any truth in this? Show me my ways and make me right before you, and everything else, that's just something they've said. He wasn't manipulated in the wilderness. Not just the wilderness, but he wasn't manipulated. The reason being, he was in line with God's word. And so many of us are confused today because we don't have God's word hid in our hearts. When we have God's word hid in our hearts, when we're memorizing scripture, when we're reading it daily, it becomes quite obvious sometimes what people are saying is manipulative. And then he didn't reward pride. Socially, I'm realizing I'm out of time. Socially, he was pure in speech and decorum. His yea was yea and his nay, nay, and he was honest with the rich young ruler. So, I want to, and spiritually, sorry. He overturned the tables. Sometimes it's appropriate to overturn some tables. I'm not going to tell you when, because there's too many examples of that. But his miracles were always to honor God. They weren't to glorify himself, and God's approval was most desired to him. Now, I'm going to leave you with a short summary of this. So, this is a book that I would recommend that you read if you haven't read it yet. There's boundaries for everything, by the way. This is just the generic one that they've written, Henry Cloud and John Townsend. But there's boundaries in dating, boundaries in marriage, boundaries with teens, boundaries with children. There's boundaries in Spanish. And then there's Beyond Boundaries, another book. And then there's another book that I really like too. It's called Safe People. Some of us don't know what safe people look like because we haven't been around a lot of them. And so if you have trouble knowing what a safe person looks like, that's a good book for you. But as you start to implement your boundaries, I want you to think of some principles. One, know what you value. You're going to have to sit down and consider mentally and emotionally what's important to me, spiritually what's important to me, socially what's important to me, physically what is important to me. You will never have good boundaries if you've never sat down to understand your values. Spirit of Prophecy tells us we should be mindful. Now, there's a secular version of mindful and there's a spiritual version of mindful. Secular mindfulness is sitting down and clearing your mind of everything and or focusing on one word. But spiritual mindfulness is what David talked about. When he said, God, show me my ways, show me what I'm doing, create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit. Well, how do you do that if you're not sitting still and paying attention to what's important? And so that's what we need to do too. I have to know what my values are because that's essentially what I believe. And once I believe in something, then it's easier to act on it. So the next thing we do is make a plan and write it down. Write down those things. There's something truly miraculous that happens when you write something down. I used to tell my students, don't type your stuff out. I know it's tempting with all the technology that we have, but research shows that there's something wonderful that happens in your brain when you actually handwrite things out. And so write it down, those things that are important to you, so you can actually see them on paper. It manifests them in a much more clear and concise way to you when you see it on paper. It makes it real. It's not just some imaginary thing in your head. And then once you make a plan and write it down, be direct with the person. You don't have to use lots of words. Ladies, I know sometimes we like to explain and then explain again and over-explain and everything. Try to take whatever is important to you, that boundary, and keep shrinking it and shrinking it and shrinking it until it's a very short sentence and it's very matter of fact. You don't have to explain why. Did you know that? You can say, I'm sorry I can't do that. Well, why not? I'm sorry I can't do that. Well, why not? I'm sorry I can't do that. As soon as you start explaining why, if say, I have too much stuff on my plate, well, now that person can say, well, I can get so-and-so to do that for you so you can do this. Yeah. I'm sorry I'm not available at that time. Sometimes I'm not available because I'm resting. I pencil in my schedule rest time. Is that wrong? No, I need it. I need it. So it's okay to just say no. I need to do this. I've had a busy week. This is what you tell yourself. I've had a busy week and I don't need to take anything else on. And maybe somebody else will be discipled to do that job too. I know some of us like to do everything in the church and we like to do everything at work, but you're actually taking away the opportunity for discipling other people to do those things too. I know you can do them better, but just like your 3-year-old, they've got to learn sometime. So it's okay. So be direct, and you have to enforce it. This is the biggest problem I find with people. They have boundaries, but they don't know how to enforce them. How do you enforce a boundary? There has to be a consequence of it. If you don't have a consequence, you're just nagging all the time. Stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that. Why? Stop doing that. How many times do I have to tell you, stop doing that? What's going to happen if I don't? Have a consequence. You have to enforce it. So you have to enforce again and again and implement the consequences for it. If there are no consequences, what's the incentive to do it? And parents, I will tell you, as long as you are paying for things, as long as you're driving, you have more power than you realize. I've heard people say, my kid will only eat chicken McNuggets. And I'm looking at the kid, I'm going, I believe that kid's about 4 years old. Now, how does that kid get to McDonald's and buy chicken McNuggets for themselves? They don't have a job. They don't have any money. They don't have a car. I don't know what to do. My kid just won't eat anything else. Do you know kids will not starve themselves? They're not that smart. So you do still have power. So implement the consequences. That's so important. And then, again, I want you to remember, healthy boundaries are always good for both parties. Before I end, I just want to say something real quickly. Have you noticed this picture here? You know, one of the things I've noticed in this picture, just sitting here the last couple of days, where is Jesus? In the middle of a storm. Usually when I see a picture like this, it's like Jesus walking on a nice path in springtime when everything's really nice. Jesus is in the middle of a storm. But do you know the beautiful part about this when we go through storms? We're with Jesus if we're following him. And that's the same with our boundaries too. Sometimes boundaries feel so hard to implement. We feel like everybody's against us or we're against everybody else. But as long as we do it with Jesus, as hard as it is, he'll make it right. Again, another shameless plug for our Brain People podcast. You can hear more about boundaries and thinking and other things. But let me just pray as we end. Dear Father in heaven, Lord, I want to thank you so, so much. Man, you are so good to us. You love us so much, and in your word, it gives us everything that we absolutely need. Sometimes we're just really dumb, And we can read things, and because of our backgrounds, we don't comprehend them. But Lord, everything is actually there. So Lord, please help us with our minds, clear them of all the cobwebs of lies and deception that we've believed that Satan's thrown at us, and help us to understand your truth. Help us to understand that your truth is the only truth. And we can abide in that truth and be happy and healthy and whole with you. So Lord, as we consider following you, help us to understand that you have boundaries. Jesus has boundaries. And in his name I pray, amen.